Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young Kim. The U.S. Biden administration made a firm response to a recent barrage of missile tests conducted by North Korea, announcing its unilateral sanctions and proposing additional sanctions at the UN Security Council. And North Korea came out defiant, suggesting it could scrap its self-imposed moratorium on nuclear and long-range ballistic missile tests. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me today is Michael O'Halloran, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Dr. O'Halloran specializes in the U.S. defense strategy and national security policy. He authored numerous books, including Crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Bruce Bennett is also with me today. Dr. Bennett is an international defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. He's an expert in Northeast Asia and military issues and has worked with the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Welcome to the show. Good to have you both today.
Thank you.
Nice to be with you.
So, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un presided over a meeting, and there the North Korean officials were given an instruction to reconsider the trust-building measures the regime has taken so far and examine whether to restart all the temporarily suspended activities. Dr. O'Halloran, is North Korea threatening that it could resume nuclear and intercontinental ballistic missile tests?
Yes, I think it is, although I'm not yet sure how seriously to take the threats. But I do think that Kim Jong-un is deciding that he doesn't like to be ignored. My overall summary of Biden policy towards North Korea so far is essentially ignoring it and hoping that whatever's going on will essentially stay quiet. And yes, North Korea continues to build more bombs, but as long as they're not exporting the bombs, perfecting the bombs, testing them, testing long-range Icbms, otherwise causing direct threats of violence or of imminent hostilities, that the Biden team will hope that essentially keeping the same pressure that we've had really since about 2017 with the big new sanctions after those tests that year, that policy will suffice. I think it was always sort of the go-to policy, the default, but it's not very creative and it's not very promising because I don't expect the North Koreans to be happy about being ignored. And I think they will do something to try to disrupt the process. Rather than respond to that disruption, I think we should be more innovative about policy up front. And I'm afraid the time is running out for that kind of Biden initiative. So with Joe Biden so busy with so many other things, I'm afraid he's hoped that he could just sort of forget about North Korea. That's usually not a smart approach.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Bennett, did you take what the North Koreans said as a threat to the United States as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think just like Michael said, they're unhappy with being ignored, but it also suggests some issues associated with the internal situation in North Korea. I mean, we see lots of evidence that North Korea has a degree of instability, not being able to feed their people very well, not being able to provide consumer goods, outside information leaking in. Kim has got to be a lot concerned about his regime. He's certainly taken very dramatic measures to try to gain greater control. So I think at this stage, just exactly as Michael has said, the U.S. tendency to want to just ignore North Korea is a really bad mistake. Kim is going to push us, here with the election coming up in South Korea. He knows that doing lots of provocations has the potential for driving votes towards the conservatives, and yet he's prepared to do that. That suggests that he's got some very strong reasons for wanting to gain more attention and for getting the U.S. to take some action. And he may perceive that the Biden administration, in their lack of action, would be willing to make some real compromises and concessions in order just to stop what's going on.
Dr. Bennett, is it really possible for North Korea to go ahead with nuclear and Icbm tests now? Is it easy for them to start right away if they want?
Well, we have to believe that over almost 5 years since Kim agreed not to do such tests, they've been developing new systems. Talking with North Korean escapees who worked in their weapon development program, they said it was a very high priority within their program to test new systems. Over 5 years, they've got probably new weapon designs. They've got new medium, intermediate, and longer range missiles. So yeah, they're probably ready to do those tests, at least some of them. And this is the kind of thing which could cause some real problems for the U.S. in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Dr. O'Hanlon, didn't North Korea claim they have destroyed a nuclear test site? Do you expect to see any test in the near future? Any nuclear test, I mean?
The North Koreans have things they would like to test. I also believe that it is not that hard to create the capacity to do nuclear tests. If you want to do them well with a lot of instrumentation, that takes a fair amount of preparation and technological expertise. And depending on just how much they really feel they need to learn about their weapons, therefore that could require certain lag time. But they could have been doing that already. The drilling that you do to prepare a nuclear test site is not the sort of thing that gives off a seismic signature. And so unless we happen to see a lot of activity at the right location, and we were already looking and we thought that was the nuclear site, and we had seen a pickup or an intensification of activity at that location, we wouldn't necessarily know exactly how far along their preparations were. And by the way, there may be people in the intelligence community who have been watching and who know the North Koreans are up to activity at this kind of a site, perhaps a previous testing site, perhaps a new one, but it doesn't violate any promise. The North Koreans just said they wouldn't test. They established a moratorium. There's no binding treaty that says you can't prepare the possibility of testing in the future. And so we may be aware of drilling and other preparation and just not really be talking about it and just not really have any recourse to prevent it. So I'm sorry, that's a long answer basically to say I think they could probably do a nuclear test pretty soon if they wanted to.
After the meeting Kim Jong-un held, North Korea said the present U.S. administration persists and maneuvers to deprive it of its right to self-defense. It also claimed the U.S. hostile policy toward North Korea will continue to exist. Dr. O'Hanlon, this is pretty similar to what we have been hearing from North Korea, but what is it saying? Does North Korea want to talk with the U.S. right now?
Well, North Korea knows we're not going to attack them. So when they talk about a hostile attitude or a threatening posture, that's nonsense. But they are in a bind because after the testing they did in 2017 with the 3 ICBMs and the nuclear test, the international sanctions that were placed at that time, even with the support of China and Russia, have been extremely strict. And a lot of the conversation in the United States, as you know, is about sanctions evasion. But what I'm struck by is the incredible deterioration in the North Korean economy over the last 5 years, which obviously COVID has intensified and exacerbated. And so if you put all that together, it's not a militarily threatening posture that we have taken. It is an economically threatening approach, at least in terms of North Korea's ability to deliver goods to its people, as Bruce Bennett was talking about a minute ago. And that's what I believe the North Koreans are going to have to try to change. They're not really afraid of being attacked by us, but they are very concerned that they are being economically strangled and that there's no end in sight for that policy, even with some of the sanctions busting that may be going on.
Dr. Bennett, many people wonder if North Korea is just using the U.S. response as an excuse for its further pursuit of the weapons program. What do you think?
Well, sure. I mean, you look at the response that the United States made and the sanctions, the new sanctions we applied, they were absolutely required. I mean, you look at the nonsense kinds of things we were allowing to go on, with major transfers of technology from a Russian firm and a Russian individual, with not just North Koreans in Russia, but also in China who were sanctioned, who were obviously getting access to technologies, which is what the North Koreans send them to those countries to do. The U.S. was really in a position where we had to take some action. So there was something that the Biden administration could do, and they did it. But the problem is, of course, Kim used that as an excuse for another escalation of activity. That was nonsense on his part. I think he simply was looking for an excuse, and he probably anticipated. I mean, 3 days after he does his last set of missile tests, he does another set of missile tests. he anticipated the U.S. was going to do something and decided to have something ready to go.
Dr. Bennett, as you said, North Korea's recent 4 missile tests, what do you think their intention was? Was it laying the groundwork for the bigger tests?
Well, certainly North Korea has been doing everything they can with shorter range missiles to improve accuracy capabilities, to improve maneuverability of weapons, many different things like that. So yes, they're probably preparing to do some other missile tests. The North kind of knew what they could get away with. I mean, Kim Jong-un has been very careful to stick in the sort of short-range missile category because he knew, starting with President Trump, that the Americans were just going to say, no big deal, he can do that, and not apply any further sanctions. And as Michael said, those sanctions are not totally crippling North Korea, but they're having a pretty serious effect on North Korea, especially when it's combined with the sanctions Kim applied himself. I mean, his closing of the border with China was his own imposition of sanctions on his economy. And I think we have to remember, every time he asks for sanctions relief, we should be responding, okay, open up your border. That's one of the biggest sanctions relief you can do. I mean, why depend upon us? Do what you need to do to remove the sanctions. That's where you ought to be starting.
Dr. Whelan, what's your view? Were North Koreans preparing themselves for the bigger tests?
I think they probably are, as one recourse. Preparing is a good word because it doesn't say if they've made a decision to do this. I think that, people are still taking stock of the Biden administration, which has now been in office for exactly a year, and wondering if there'll be some new initiative. If you do a big test, you're sort of poisoning the chalice, and it's going to be pretty hard for a Biden team to then offer any positive initiatives, if for no other reason than the domestic politics of how that would look here in the United States for a President Biden who, of course, suffered the debacle of his Afghanistan withdrawal, and therefore already feels a bit on the ropes about any policy that would smack of weakness. So the idea of reaching out a hand to Kim Jong-un, to paraphrase Barack Obama's first inaugural address, or to mimic Donald Trump's diplomacy, that would be tougher for Biden after a big test. So I think Kim benefits more from preparing, from threatening, and from seeing if maybe he can induce the Biden team to show a little bit more focus and maybe creativity. I still think there's the potential for, a medium-sized deal that would essentially allow the North Koreans, at least for now, to keep their nuclear weapons, but verifiably dismantle their nuclear production capability. And the latter is much easier to monitor than an elimination of the former. And it's more realistic. I don't think the Kim family jewels are going to be easily relinquished by the North Korean dictator. But he may decide with 50, 60, 70 bombs, he's got enough, if that could lead to at least major sanctions relief. Not necessarily all sanctions being eliminated, but major sanctions relief. So that kind of a deal is what I believe the Biden team should explore. And I think, you'd have to do it at a reasonably high level because the North Koreans have not shown any interest in normal sort of assistant secretary of state type diplomacy. I think they're going to have to, doesn't have to be Joe Biden going over the way Donald Trump would travel to Singapore, Vietnam, or the DMZ, but maybe Jake Sullivan. Maybe something more evocative of what the Clinton administration did in '94 when they sent Jimmy Carter. Those are the kinds of ideas I think the Biden team needs to look at.
Well, the U.S. State Department said earlier that the U.S. has a number of tools in their arsenal, and it said the U.S. will continue to use those tools to hold North Korea accountable for its violations, and it gave the example of UN Security Council resolutions. However, as expected, China and Russia blocked the UN Security Council from imposing additional sanctions. The U.S. ended up releasing a joint statement with other 7 countries to call on UN members to fully implement sanctions on North Korea. Dr. Bennett, what did you make of the situation? Does the U.S. really have enough tools?
Well, the U.S. has tools. We're just not using a lot of the ones we have potentially available. I mean, sure, President Trump thought about doing a bloody nose strategy. That doesn't make much sense. That's going to cause a conflict that we don't want. I mean, after all, we've been applying economic sanctions, as Michael said, since 2017 that are pretty serious and that Russia and China agreed to. Note that in North Korea, Kim constantly says they're U.S. sanctions. He never seems to recognize the authority of the UN, the fact that the UN is an important entity. Why aren't we talking about the UN being an important entity? Why aren't we talking about China and Russia having agreed to the sanctions that are in place and saying in particular, Kim, look, if you don't want the sanctions, here were the conditions that caused the sanctions to be applied. All you have to do to get the sanctions removed is to follow the conditions that was specified. No tests, no nuclear weapons, no production. As Michael said, getting them at least to do some form of production freeze is clearly the key thing to be doing right now. And that's what the U.S. ought to be asking for. We don't have to have a total solution, but we at least need to get some movement going at this stage, because as the IAEA chief recently said, North Korea is going full bore on its nuclear production, for all we can tell.
Mm-hmm. Dr. O'Hanlon, U.S. Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas-Greenfield used the word attack to describe North Korea's recent missile tests. And she also said the U.S. and the international community have to let North Korea know that their actions are unacceptable. Do you think this is time for more pressure?
I don't think it's going to work very well in isolation for a number of reasons that we've been discussing, knowing full well, for example, that China and Russia have been reluctant to think about an intensification of pressure, and U.S.-China and U.S.-Russia relations right now are poor to begin with. It's still sort of remarkable, again, picking up on what Bruce mentioned and what I had said earlier, it's remarkable how many sanctions and how many tough sanctions we were able to persuade the UN Security Council to impose in 2017. At that time, we were coming on the heels of the Russian seizure of Crimea, NATO's buildup in the Baltic states and Poland, the Russian attempt to sway the US presidential election. All of that was the backdrop to the 2017 tests. And yet Russia went along with the sanctions. Maybe they wanted to do Donald Trump a favor. Maybe they, however, realized that there was really no recourse except to be tough on North Korea after 3 ICBM tests and a nuclear test. Even China went along at a time when President Trump was being extremely critical of China. There was no warmth in the U.S.-China relationship in the early months of the Trump presidency, but China went along. I think that's the most we can realistically expect from those two countries, especially while North Korea does continue the ICBM and nuclear testing moratoria and doesn't otherwise violently destabilize the peninsula. So, we should also come back to a point that Bruce mentioned and that, Young, I know you're well aware of, which is, of course, the upcoming South Korean presidential election. And if we allow this issue to just sort of go on autopilot and be at the mercy of what Kim may do, then there's no telling what effect that will have on the South Korean elections and what a new South Korean government may think about the state of the US-ROK alliance. And there's the distinct possibility of a weakening alliance or a fraying approach towards North Korea, which, if we're not careful, is something that Kim may try to pursue. So I think that it's a good moment, maybe the last good moment, for the Biden team to come up with its own bolder North Korea policy. I'd like to see that really in these next few weeks.
Then, if North Korea grows more provocative, what measures does the U.S. have to take?
We don't really have great military options. We're already in pretty good shape on defense and deterrence. We don't really have any plausible way to develop an offensive capability that's safe to employ. With sanctions, we're not going to get more help from China or Russia unless there's a major breakdown and major misbehavior by North Korea above and beyond what's happening today. So I think within the current parameters, we're more or less stuck. And small provocations are just going to get small responses. And that's pretty much all we have available to us. I think there is room for creative diplomacy, but we're going to have to get after it. And Barack Obama and Donald Trump have essentially both provided political cover to Joe Biden because they've both been in favor of this kind of outreach to extremist regimes. So the politics, I think, are a little more possible than perhaps President Biden is currently assessing. What will not be viable, and I'll finish on this point, if the North Koreans do a big test, at that point it will be too late in terms of American politics to come up with a big outreach or overture towards Pyongyang. But right now, as long as we stay resolute on the sanctions and on our defense posture, I think we have room for maneuver in terms of diplomatic flexibility and proposals for some kind of a medium big deal.
This is a time to be thinking again about carrots and sticks. What can we offer North Korea that they're interested in that would allow them to justify making some kind of compromise that we could ask for? So, for example, we know that North Korea has been very anxious to get Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. They've refused other kinds of vaccines. They seem to be very interested in the mRNA vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna. What would happen if the U.S. said, look, we're prepared to offer you 3 million doses of Moderna or Pfizer as a vaccine, enough for key elements of your elites. But in order to do that, we'd like to ask you to do X. In addition, I think we need to be thinking about ways to get more effective information into North Korea. For example, I think we ought to ask North Korea, we ought to offer to North Korea and say, we're happy to take 30 or 50 North Korean graduate students into major U.S. universities. We'll do exchanges of military personnel on the peninsula. Radical kinds of ideas like that would be very difficult in some ways politically to justify. And yet, I think those are ways, I mean, Kim can always say no to those things. But boy, will his elites be furious if he does, because that would give them outside information that they very much would like to have and contact they would like to have. So we need to look at this win-win kind of offers where we could ask for certain things and offer certain things where he might feel more compelled to start then really not formally negotiating, but trading in ways that are the what kind of thing that Michael's been talking about.
We're now 3 weeks into the year 2022, and North Korea started the year in bellicose mode, rushing with its missile tests, while the U.S. responded firmly, hitting back with its own sanctions. Will the U.S. be able to find a lead for the future talks with North Korea? Or will the situation grow more contentious? We'll just have to wait and see. Mr. O'Hanlon and Mr. Bennett, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.